Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Rework in Insurance Virtual Summit. My name is Natalia Bailey, and I'm a policy advisor of digital finance at the Institute of International Finance. Our panel today will be discussing the future of AI and regulation in finance and insurance. And we have a great panel today, which I think have very complementary views on this topic. I'm joined today by Irina Velkova, Senior Manager at Grant Thornton, Edosa Odaro, Chief Data Officer at AXA, and Julie Wall, she's a reader in computer science at University of East London. So we really have a great panel with us today, and I'm quickly going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves before getting right into the discussion. Irina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining the summit indeed. As Natalia kindly said, my name is Irina Velkova, and I'm part of Grant Thornton's FinTech practice. That is a practice that brings together new emerging technology providers and matching them with technology adopters and well-established financial services institutions. My focus is around the regulatory angle of technology adoption, and my day-to-day work includes managing large financial services regulatory projects across banking, insurance, investment management, and particularly developing new services that leverage current technology trends and new tech financial services solutions.
Edosa, do you want to go next?
I would love to. So just a quick update, actually. So I've actually moved on from AXA. So I was head of data at AXA for about 4.5 years. I've actually now moved on to a company called Theory and Practice, where I'm Chief Business Officer at the moment. So that's a slight update there. My actual role as Chief Business Officer is, well, looking across the entire organization, across the value chain, actually, informing delivery into our clients. The company in itself, Theory and Practice, is an AI consultancy business, which is really about taking what is theory in edge research type work and actually making it real, which is not to be taken for granted in today's world. Really sort of high demand. So that's me.
And Julie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Natalia. So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julie Wall, and I'm a reader in computer science at the University of East London. So I'm coming at it from more of an academic research point of view, and I'm looking at from deep learning, natural language processing, and we're currently working on a research project looking to detect deception in speech, focusing on claims calls in the insurance industry.
So we really have a really good mix in our panel today. And I think we have a lot of ground to cover, and we only have 30 minutes. So I think this is we're going to have to be very mindful of time. But we are trying to cover here the future trends in AI as they relate to finance and insurance, the impact of regulation, any barriers for safe adoption, and what is needed to overcome those. From my point of view, the adoption and implementation of AI and machine learning has progressed quite a lot in the last 4 years. Financial services, they're now using it for credit risk, the detection of money laundering, fraud, as well as marketing, operational risk, and many other areas. And when we talk about what regulators have doing, they have really scaled up their knowledge in the last couple of years in our discussions that we had with supervisors and regulators around the world. Last year, the Bank of England published their Future of Finance report. They touch on a lot of aspects that we're going to be discussing today. The use of data that is increasing rapidly in investment in technology, how it can boost productivity and innovations, and just the fact that the economy is becoming more digital. And if we think about COVID, the impact of COVID for finance is also something that will be interesting if we can maybe touch on. So let's just start with Julie, since she went last with introductions. Julie, in your view, how is AI transforming the financial ecosystem? What can the industry gain by using AI machine learning solutions?
I would say that AI is transforming the financial ecosystem mainly in terms of automation. So of course, we've had computers around for many years. We've had machines which have been programmed to do specific tasks. But AI is really coming in coming really strong at the moment, and it's utilized across many different industries. For example, in terms of customer service, where we have chatbots, we have insurance claims assessment, fraud detection, which I've been looking at in terms of speech. We have underwriting, risk assessment, risk management. So everything that you've mentioned, computers were a part of the process, and now AI is becoming really strong, really mature in being able to take on these big tasks. For example, computers have been used for years to make trades in the financial services. However, these were traditionally kind of static models, which were kind of developed to solve a specific problem, and then you needed to have a lot of human intervention to make sure and keep an eye on everything that was going on. AI is now being brought in to really improve this kind of process, and we've got huge amounts of data available. We've got these really, I would say, not so much mature, but we've got these really exciting, really strong deep learning models, which is actually able to make use of that data. I was doing a bit of reading around this, and I heard that, for example, in Goldman Sachs, their trading desk in New York, in around 2000, they had 600 people working as traders, and now there's 2. And it's all being taken over, and we can, all of that is being taken over, not just by programs which would have been written, but also by AI programs, deep learning models, which are being developed to really, learn from this huge amounts of data available, but also improve the models ongoing as well. So I think that's what automation, full stop, is kind of where AI is really coming in.
Edosa, what is your view on that?
No, I'll agree with Julie there in terms of, I think up to now, actually now, hypothetically, if you like, is the pre-COVID world, there was absolutely that view, and within finance and insurance, there was certainly the view that, it's automation, is about taking, in effect, costs out of the system, and it was certainly, RPA became, robotics or process automation became quite a big thing. And a lot of the kinds of things that, Julie was just mentioning there would link into that very, very nicely. I think what we're seeing actually now with COVID coming in is there's, of course, we've always had this, customer is all important, customer experience, etc. I think now we're moving a lot further away from that just lip service for customer to actually trying to create real customer value. And that's the feeling that we're actually finding now as we talk to a lot of execs in the marketplace are really focusing a lot more around that. But the key thing about that is that value piece, and it's really about, it's not just about funky AI anymore. I can do this algorithm and that, I can make you a cup of coffee. It's really pretty much, and I was speaking to some execs and some very big banks actually, and it's a no nonsense approach now to AI projects. Of course, COVID has come, there's economic impacts. And so the scrutiny around budgets and what's spent is a lot more stringent now. So it's a lot more focused on, okay, you want to do this thing, you want to do that sort of use case. What is it actually going to deliver, and how can you demonstrate that before we invest billions of pounds into it? So it's really a business sense to that shift in towards value. So that's what I'm actually seeing, actually, and it's very exciting, actually.
What about you, Irina?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what Julie and Edosa said. Frankly, they've covered it pretty much all. I think definitely in terms of increased productivity and efficiencies across all industries has been enormous impact, and it will continue to be delivered by artificial intelligence. I guess the bits, picking up on Edosa's point about customer value, I can certainly see the development of the use of AI moving into that direction, particularly when it comes to improving customer experience, but also how customers make decisions about certain, let's say, investments or other financial decisions, and the ability to not only have access to the data, but this data being analyzed and presented to them in a manner which is easily digestible, and then for them to make decisions which are informed and are probably aligned to their values and interests. I think is fascinating how many more things we can do with that nowadays. I think ESG is a really good example, frankly, where you receive, or investment managers receive, a lot of information, a huge amount of information, of data, which has to be analyzed and then invested appropriately in line with customers' interests. The ability of AI to process this data and this information and then present it in a version where the right decisions can be made, but also picking up on patterns and then divesting, reinvesting, reallocating portfolios. I think huge opportunities there to create value for customers and for clients in general.
So that actually brings us to the next part of what I wanted to bring up here with the barriers. And Edosa, you made a good point here about the customer value. So what are the barriers, both internal and external, that you're seeing that they're preventing or hindering financial institutions from delivering these AI solutions? And I think it's interesting if you bring the customer value point, because I would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I think that we've literally touched on a key one. Prior to now, I think the first thing to think about is why people do the things they do, in some ways the way they do it. And it's really interesting. Prior to COVID, obviously we're in an up market, and there was we had sound financial sort of basis. A lot of the incentive for doing things was the competitive environment. Everyone else was doing it, so you've got to be investing in the AI. And there was a lot of investment for the sake of, just get a few data scientists in and kind of do it. I think what we're finding is actually there's a shift now. People actually feel like there's a need, but at the same time, you've got more scrutiny, right? So you've got this sort of almost dichotomy, if you like, between the two. It's a bit of a conundrum for big execs saying, actually, now I need it more. I need it either to survive in a shrinking market, or I need it to grow where markets are actually expanding, like in a sort of a non-essential or essential retail, actually, and gaming and things like that. So there is that drive, but like you say, the barriers, well, there's standard barriers, regulatory barriers and things like that, which you already started to touch on. I think those are actually diminishing in some ways because there's a huge amount more understanding now. Part of that is just a realization that we're not necessarily as radically removed from where we were before. We were sort of static models before. Okay, the models are a bit more dynamic. It's a bit more difficult to explain. There's a little bit of a sense of, okay, don't put a model in there just for the sake of it. Don't make it complex just for the sake of it. Think about the use case. Think about what you're actually trying to achieve, and think about the fact that actually there is going to be a need to explain as much as possible of this. So bear that in mind when you're designing and thinking about things. But I think the big barrier we're seeing that's a new thing, if you like, is this idea of scrutiny. It's really about how can you predict. So if I was going to bring to you a business case that wasn't AI, I was trying to create a new product, I was trying to do whatever else within my business, you don't come in with a blank sheet and just go, this is exciting. Actually, you come up with a business case that says, here's what we need to spend, but here's what we look to actually achieve by doing this. And here's how we can validate that, etc. Right? Before you actually get that investment. I think that's interesting. I was speaking to a couple of chief data officers at big banks, and that's where they're thinking now. They're finding that budgets are shifting away from this vanity type budget lines into, let's think about this like anything else. So that's what I'm actually finding. Yeah.
I actually agree with you. Irina, do you want to maybe touch on the regulatory issues that you see here?
Yeah, sure. I guess just to add to what Edosa covered in the above point or the above question, I think where we see quite a lot of challenge for our customers, particularly for our clients and firms, is still a little bit of a lack of understanding as to what exactly AI can deliver and AI solutions can be beneficial for. And I think this is where actually firms tend to contact us the most, because there's so much going on the market in terms of opportunities to deploy AI that they're not necessarily sure where from, frankly. And then linked to that perhaps is, and Edosa touched on that kind of explainability point around the understanding around what are actual capabilities of the AI, what can be done with it. So that ultimately almost brings a little bit more of a cultural element and the lack of trust in AI still. So I think we still have a little bit of a way to go that direction. And I think the only third point very quickly I'll mention on that is along the lines of what is it that can be achieved with AI? I think where the biggest kind of mismatch between expectations in terms of deployment of AI and reality is that AI is not going to miraculously sort out all our regulatory problems that we have, for example, in our businesses, as much as the technology or the solutions are genius, unless we have the right processes in place, the right policies, and we know what kind of outcomes we're aiming at, regardless of the use of the technology, we're not going to get there. And that brings us to the point that what is the regulator actually, or what are the regulators looking for when it comes to assessing artificial intelligence and what they're expecting of firms. And I think Edosa covered the point around explainability brilliantly. I don't need to cover again that, but there is definitely the issue that it is still considered a black box, and the regulators themselves do not necessarily understand, nobody actually understands, whether the inputs into the model and the outputs correlate and how they correlate. And then the biggest problem in my view for the regulators is, and will be, and now I'm going to sound as an accountant, I'm a lawyer by the way, but this around accountability and the AI solutions being auditable, because the challenge you've got is not only that you've provide inputs which somehow come up with certain outputs and you don't really know what's going on in the box, but also that this is not really done by a human, it's done by a model which is created by humans, but then it's perhaps a number of individuals or organizations involved in the creation of that model. It is also the scale of the applicability of this AI solution, because you can normally apply this across a number of business processes and functions. And then very often on the top of everything else, it can be in-house designed and delivered model, but can be outsourced. So then this brings a really huge problem along the lines of who is accountable for what. And then that brings us to the next point, which regulators will necessarily raise when they consider artificial intelligence or technology in general, which is the one around governance of it. And the expectations are certainly going to be along the lines of then the board must be accountable for it as well. There must be someone who is in charge, which very often organizations understand that as like, oh, we're going to have a CTO or CDO who are going to be in charge. But that's exactly where I think firms do not necessarily match with the regulators, who are expecting that everybody actually who is on the board in the senior management has a role to play in that and has an oversight role and a governance role in the whole process. So I think these are key issues that the regulators are certainly looking for that. And I think the other one, which I'm going to certainly mention, is the point around bias, and not necessarily the bias per se as to how they apply to the models, but the fact that the scalability of AI solutions can suddenly multiply the effect or the impact of the bias applied into an AI solution. So if you think, for example, humans also make mistakes and obviously they're subjective, etc., etc. But then usually that's an impact which is quite limited to a certain transaction or whatever it was within the remit of this particular individual. When the bias or the error is within the model, which is applied across the whole business, then that brings a whole new world of scalability issues related to bias, which I think a lot of us and a lot of the firms and even the regulators are still going to have to digest going forward. So I think these are the main, in my view at least, these are the main considerations the regulators are still having and will have to deal with going forward in order to make sure that we've got appropriate oversight and some sort of trust in the solutions we can deploy.
I think you've touched on really some of the key barriers. And before I give Julie the opportunity to respond here, so at the IF, we have been doing, actually started last year, a survey on machine learning governance. So we're looking at how our member institutions, what's the governance structure that they have in place for machine learning models. And we're actually going to be publishing that in the next month. Some of the things that you've touched on about who's responsible, about vendor models, about regulators' expectations and whatnot, like that would all be covered in our report. So I think, I mean, making a plug for some of the work that we are doing, but I think it'll be, some of it will be of interest. on the point you're making about regulators, what I found interesting is we had a meeting last week with the Fed and with the U.S. Fed, and as well as some of the other U.S. agencies, and also with the EBA. And what I'm noticing really is that there are many people use AI and machine learning to mean very different things. And at the end, my impression is that what regulators want to see from AI machine learning is the same robustness that they would see with any other type of model. So at the end of the day, whether what a bank or an insurer calls AI or machine learning doesn't really matter. Ultimately, they want to see the same levels of scrutiny in the model. So governance is actually key. So I'll let Julie talk now about what are the barriers that she's seeing. And I think, Julie, you bring a really interesting point because you actually are the expert on these topics in our panel.
Pressure. I guess from an academic point of view, I'm kind of involved in research and I'm involved with students. So, teaching students coming out as the next generation of data scientists and AI modelers, PhD students, we are now trying to focus on that bias explainability, that they're going to be making these models and they have to understand how do the models work. AI is kind of drifting into these models are just available and people can run them. But to really make sure that there is governance on how these models are used, they really need to know how they work. They need to understand the maths behind it, and really important, they need to understand the data itself. So these big, huge data sets are being gathered. They can have personal information, they can have biometric information, and how is that actually used? Do they need to be used? There's a lot of issues with facial recognition systems being developed, and there was no human in the loop. It was just an automatic system where they were making a decision based on that snapshot in time. And do we need to make these processes, or do we need to make systems for financial services, insurance, that need that personal information? It's just because we have that information doesn't mean that we have to choose to use it, because it's problematic. If there's bias in the data, the model's going to be biased. If the decisions are being developed that are evaluating groups of people unfairly, that model is going to do it at large, at scale. So that's kind of, from an academic point of view, we're trying to make sure that students coming out, or the next generation of developers, kind of are mindful of that. But also, in my own experience working with insurance companies, they are very concerned about, the explainability of the product. If they're going to put a product in place which is going to detect something that somebody is doing, for example, we're working on detecting fraud in speech. And again, that's looking at somebody's personal information. It's their speech tag, it's what they're saying, and we have to be able to do that in an explainable way. So as Marina was saying, there can't be a black box anymore. We can't make decisions on huge groups of people without understanding why the decision was being made. And also, along with explainability, we have to decide, well, what do we want that output of a AI model to be, whether it's using deep learning, machine learning. Do we want it to be, like, we're working on models where we have to be very careful about false positive, true negatives. Is it more problematic to falsely accuse people than it is to miss a few cases, and, it's like, we can develop a model, but then we also have to tune it to be to the way that the model should be used ethically and within the within the industry. So I guess it's just purely developing a model that works is not really the issue anymore. And I think what Joseph was saying about that value piece, I think maybe because AI is becoming mature, that we can now choose how we use it, and it's not just this big exciting thing anymore that just, it's there, so let's use it. But let's use it, be more wise and ethical about how we use it, and do we actually need it in the first place, and do we need every bell and whistle, or do we just need the things which are the most important?
I hear a lot that we brought up about into the discussion about ethics, bias, and since we are already on that topic, so what can firms do to mitigate biases? For example, Julie, you were bringing up the importance of evaluating groups of people. But is it true that if you take, for example, in the US, firms cannot use sensitive attributes? But if they are not using sensitive attributes, can they still test for whether when they're doing their monitoring of those models, when they're validating those models, can they find those biases if they don't have those attributes in place?
It's two things. It's understanding the data balance, for example, across different categories of people, if the data is making decisions on people. Can we recognize that bias in the data that's being collected? And then in the model itself, is the model actually doing what people think it's doing? So there was a really kind of, it's probably like an urban legend now, but they created an AI model which was able to detect between two types of husky dogs and wolves, and the model was working 100% accurate, which is always very suspicious anyway. It was 100% accurate, and then when they actually delved down into it, which is kind of exposing what the model is doing, all it was really doing was, in every picture of a wolf there was snow in the background. So the model appeared to be working perfectly. It could tell the difference between a husky and a wolf, but actually what it was doing, it was recognizing snow and not snow. So when models are being developed and they appear to be working perfectly, they're not always necessarily doing what the developers think they're doing. So it's that understanding the data, understanding the model, and then understanding the output of that model. And, how is it working? When is it successful? When is it failing? And when it's successful, is it actually doing what they think? Is the decision actually based on the features of the data that they think it's been based on, etc.? So it's more than just, bias in, it's not really just about bias in developers at all. It's about how the data is collected. Is the data balanced? Is the model clear? Is the output make sense?
Yeah, if I can add to that very quickly, actually. So this piece around bias is, of course, yes, as you know, very, very contentious. And I think that one of the things in a previous talk that I had, which is actually focused a lot around bias, was very much about, the source of bias. And a lot of us, of course, especially people within the field, know that bias, in effect, predominantly comes from data. The thing that we don't actually face up to squarely is where that data actually comes from. And a lot of that data comes from us. So it's how we think, is how, our behaviors, right? And I think Irina touched on it there, earlier as well. It's very much about, it's almost like AI is coming in to scale us. It's always like putting the mirror in front of you, but the image that comes out of that mirror gets broadcast across the planet rather than just in the privacy of your bedroom or wherever else. So I think that becomes quite a big issue. But touching back on Julie's point, that's where really focusing on this balance between, true positive, the whole kind of confusion matrix, if you like, becomes quite essential, because whilst we know we're not going to be able to correct all the data because we can't correct ourselves overnight, we can't correct the source of all the data, it's very difficult to even assess whether data is balanced or not. Your decision around whether it's balanced in itself can be biased. But I think really thinking deeply about what is our objective function, what is the thing, what is really important in this situation. And it's interesting, we're talking to a client recently about a problem they're trying to solve. It's about returns. It's a retail client, and they're thinking about, how can we predict returns and then do something about it, sort of intervene in that transaction or whatever else. If we know, say Julie was going to return this pair of shoes or whatever, can we intervene in that sort of process? The initial thinking was very much around how can we increase precision, can get that precision to the max we can. But when we demonstrate to them actually that depending on what your objective function was, that may not be the better thing to do. You might want to look at the recall side, and what you're actually trying to do might be sitting somewhere in between this sort of scale. And so the focus then in this day and age where we know that there's going to be bias out there is really questioning to what extent do I need to bear this in mind and not focus predominantly on it's just got to be all the true positives or all the, it's really about the objective you're trying to actually get at. So I think that's an important thing to consider as you look to implement AI.
Thank you, Dosa. Irina, do you want to jump in maybe with your views? How can we mitigate biases in AI and machine learning?
Yeah, I think I'll give it the strict regulatory angle in my view first, and then I'll give my my kind of bigger question that I'm trying to contemplate on. And the first one is, I think, touches very much on Julie's points around making sure that we understand what the models do. But I would add in the typical regulatory view, which is like actually incorporating and establishing controls at the output level, if you like, and or the input level, and then at the output level. So making sure that at the design stage, for example, of the models, there is some sort of control to ensure that there is not so much bias, or indeed that the model is going to deliver what we are hoping it's going to deliver. But then this needs to be done on an ongoing basis as well, and then at the output level as well, in my view, basically additional controls to ensure indeed the objectives are achieved. What in practice this means to me is that inevitably AI can be used successfully only when there is appropriate human oversight, basically an overlay from us. And I think that's at this point in time, in my view, this is how we can perhaps make it work going forward for the time being. Then on the slightly bigger question around ethics and use of AI, I think picking up on Adolf's point, I think it's absolutely right that all the input and all the data comes from us. And I think it's a little bit idealistic to think that this is not going to be biased, because we are all biased, and we as a human society are still dealing with all these biases. We are trying to tackle points such as diversity, ethnicity, for example, all sorts of other diversity, for example, all sorts of other societal issues. And having said that, thinking that we can suddenly provide objective data, which then can be inputted into models, which are then multiplied at a massive scale, I think is a bit bizarre, frankly. So we need to think carefully whether we want to do that and how we do it, and is it worth doing it at all? And then to me, the bigger question, or the biggest question, is like, how ethical is it all to almost outsource our decision making to a software or solution? Because that's what we're trying to do here. We are kind of using all the benefits of the technology, indeed, for a number of, let's say, beneficial reasons such as productivity, efficiency, etc. But ultimately, we are outsourcing something we are at the moment entitled to do and accountable to do. And we have to think, I think, very strongly and thoroughly, do we really want to outsource our world to the software? Is it also ethical to do it? Isn't it still our world?
I was going to ask a different question, but I like two of the points you made, and I'm going to ask Edosa and Julie to maybe jump on that. The human oversight, what is your view? How important is it in the use of AI and machine learning? And then the second point that Irina made here about the bias in the models, like, I mean, we all agree data is inherently biased because it comes from humans. What can be done about it? For example, a lot of the discussions that I've seen with financial institutions that we've been talking to is that they've been trying to hire different talent that is more diverse. So the people that are working on those algorithms, the people that are designing different models, they are more diverse. And so there's more diversity in the programmers and the different, this is just looking not only at the data, but also who's working on that. But I want to hear from Edosa and Julie on those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. So I think a couple of things. So the first is really around how can we, I suppose I start with the diversity piece, right? So I think one of the things I struggle with is diversity looked at through very simple lenses. And I think that, and there's no disrespect, lots of people think about, gender diversity, ethnicity and the likes. And they're all very important, racial diversity and things like that. But I think those are, to me, almost the physical things, the things we can see, right? The kinds of diversity, I think, that actually hides in data to a very large degree is those things that we can't, like things like your class, your background, and those kinds of things that, are a bit softer and slightly more difficult to see. And I think that's the area of diversity that I think really needs to be focused on. Those slightly invisible, those kinds of things that don't shout up in front of you. But also the other element of it, which of course it's easy to think, okay, let's solve that diversity problem. So we have our development teams, or it's not just development, it's design, it's the requirements. It's like, who are the guys actually choosing what we focus on? Irina touched on that. What is really worth looking at? But it's also about, when you get these people into a room, does everyone have a voice? And that's a massive piece to look at. Some people call this inclusion, but really you're not going to get the correct outcomes of diversity if people don't have that voice and that sort of to bring to the table. So that's how I think about the diversity piece, and how you can sort of look at that. Is really to start from, actually, in some ways, the point of inclusion, as opposed to overly focused on diversity. When you get inclusion to work, you get the best of what you've currently got. You've got the best of the people and the minds you've currently got in the room, and then perhaps look to attract more broader base. In terms of this challenge of human intervention or not, very important, of course. I think the big thing is this idea that a big part of AI is really about scale. So in some ways, I think some of us touched on this already. If you've got really small scale, I can only affect a single individual. The cost of a mistake or the cost of getting things wrong is much reduced. It's still not great, don't get me wrong, but it is much reduced. When you're talking about something that scales through the planet in a second, then the considerations need to be different. And I think that's where this decision, and I think we touched on it when we talked about the objective functions. What are the things that really matter, aside from just accuracy or things, the more mechanical things that people think about, is what is the cost of success? What's the cost of failure? What do you get from success, but what do you lose in the failure side? And that needs to be a lot brought more into the decision making as to what needs to be fully automated, semi-automated, what needs to be done at all, in terms of those conversations. That'll be my kind of view. A lot more thinking around, what values it's bringing, but what could it potentially cause on the negative side as well.
Yeah, I guess most of the topics have really been covered, but the one thing I have noticed when it comes to, say, bias and data is that, people nowadays talk about data as big data, it's available. It's not actually that available. It's available to big companies, it's available, but it's not shared. So when, it's like everybody's trying to solve the same problems, but only with their viewpoint on the data that they have collected, because the big companies don't share data, or the data that they do share has been extracted that is almost meaningless. So, I think that's going to be an issue over the next 3 to 5 years. It's about developing solutions based on this data that should be available, but sharing these solutions and sharing the data. So it's people don't, or these big companies, they don't just create solutions based on their customers. It's something that's, if we're trying to remove bias and we're trying to make AI models more ethical, maybe, I think that's something that will have to be solved. And I've noticed it, and we work a lot with Innovate UK. They fund small companies to develop solutions, and that's a huge problem for small companies. They can't get access to these, big, huge data sets to actually make real world solutions. And I just think there's something there. I think that's going to be an issue, and I think that's part of the overall problem.
Agreed.
Thank you, Julie. So I think we have time for just one quick question. And I'm just gonna ask you to be brief so that we don't go over the time, but how do you see AI impacting the industry in the foreseeable future? Julie, do you wanna go first since you went last?
Okay, I'm going to go from my personal point of view. I think speech is the way to go. I think how companies are going to be able to interact with their customers, and I think natural language understanding people, being able to understand what they say, it's so difficult. I'm terrible at understanding what people say to me, let alone trying to train a computer to be able to do it. It's a difficult problem, but it's becoming, the techniques out there are becoming more mature, they're becoming stronger, but the big drive is for machines to be able to communicate with humans in a way that humans are comfortable with. And you know, chatbots were a bit naff really for the last 10 years, and now maybe in the last very recently they're becoming much more sophisticated, and they are making a much bigger impact on, say, like customer services call centers than they used to be. You know, they're not just a kind of a smiley face on the front of somebody's website. I think they are becoming a lot more powerful, and as the research develops and being able to understand what people are saying and why are they saying it and what do they actually mean, I think yeah, communication through speech is going to be huge.
Thank you, Julie. Irina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think it will probably change going forward, not only the way we do things, but actually how we think about things. And having said that, I mean, I'm particularly keen, for example, to see AI driving more transparency in matters such as, let's say, impact investing. And I think the opportunity to be able to assess and see how, for example, your money is invested and whether it is used to drive some positive change in the world, let's say, has got an enormous place in the future world for me. And I think there is already an increasing demand on behalf of customers. And we think about AI being there not only to present us with the opportunities, but actually demonstrating to us with building some hypothesis, for example, how is our money going to drive positive change in real terms, and kind of almost runs us through these different outcomes. And then we make our decision based on that. I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how this could potentially happen in practice. We may not go there at all, but I have a dream, as they say. So that's one for sure. I think it will certainly drive the creation of new jobs as well. I think that is going to be really interesting, and how this world develops, particularly because inevitably some of the activities we're doing in our day-to-day work today, we will be replaced by technology, whether that's AI or related RPA technology. We will have to start thinking of jobs which are more adding value rather than these kind of things we're doing today. I think this is where, hopefully, this is where future is going from my perspective.
Edosa, do you want to go ahead and give us your where you see this going in the future?
So I think for me, I'll keep it short because we're running out of time. I think the key thing for me is around friction. And that's, I think, where real value comes out. If you think about some of the biggest organizations in the world, it's really about which ones are able to take friction out of the system. The friction, I think, that's most important right now is really, I think perhaps least obstructive, is around customer. It's really about customer value. Think about insurance as an example. You put a claim in, you've had an accident. Think about the pain, you're in distress, and you have to go in on the phone, you know, into your insurance company trying to register that claim. And then you have this whole thing around getting yourself home and whatever else. I think that's where AI comes in and really delivers some value in integrating all of that value chain and actually bringing taking all the frictions out. I think for me, that's really where it gets exciting, because it really touches people and actually adds value to our individual lives.
Thank you, Edosa. We really had a great discussion, and we run out of time. I think we went over a little bit, but I think the discussion really shows how interwoven some of these topics are, like the criticality of data, automation, customer value. We talked about explainability, bias, ethics. I think all of those are very important topics, and we could probably talk a bit longer about those. So thank you so much for joining this panel. I think we really given our viewers a really interesting discussion. Thank you.